We're live.
Sounds good.
Mike, thanks for coming by.
Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
So you're a state representative in District 5.
4.
Carroll
4, yep.
Carroll 4. And those towns include?
All the way from Wakefield all the way up north, almost to Conway. So we got Freedom, Eaton, Effingham, Brookfield, Wakefield.
And what year did you first run?
First ran was, 25, so 20, was it 21 when I ran? I started and I got in 24, so that must be right, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
And how you liking it?
Oh, boy, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's not always a lot of fun. It's something that's necessary and needs to be done, but I'm a strategic kind of thinker, and we are so far behind the curve, the things that need to happen to fix things and put things where they should be. It seems almost impossible to get to where we need to be fast enough. So it's frustrating at times, but
Can that happen just at a state level?
sure. In terms of fixing stuff, sure, because I mean, there's lots of mechanisms in place. We're a dual sovereign nation, right? Well, federal nation. So we have the state governments have a sovereign entity, and then you have the federal government, which is a sovereign entity. But the federal government's supposed to be limited to only those powers the states gave them when they established the federal government. So ever since the founding, it was always assumed that if things went wrong, for instance, a bad Supreme Court decision, well, the only thing the Supreme Court has in their back pocket is honor and prudence. So if they throw that out the window, they have no way to enforce their own edicts. So it was assumed that if they went crazy and started doing weird things, they would just be ignored, which is, sort of a foundational principle of nullification, which was championed by Madison and others. But as it so happened, it turns out that there was apparently more fear of enacting nullification and saying no than they had predicted. So we wound up in this situation where even though states have the full authority and right to say no to the federal government where they are obviously overreaching, they've been want to do that. And it's especially complicated because of the whole thing that happened around slavery and the Civil War and then the Civil Rights era where some of these principles were misused. But yeah, there's certainly things you can do at the state level.
Okay. So as far as us being behind, elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, it's sort of the way I see things in terms of our country, where we're headed, the problems we're facing. I figure we've got at least a dozen, if not more, existential threats to the existence of our state and nation over the next, I don't know, you can label them short, medium, long term, and they fall in different categories. Everything from the flood of illegal immigration, which not only poses a severe economic hardship on this country, but we've got at any given time perhaps as many as 200,000 to 300,000 military-aged Chinese in this country who are, in one way or another, have to be loyal to their government, because the way that China works is they basically hold people hostage. So they have to do what Chinese government wants them to do if they all of a sudden decided to activate them to military ends, which we see all the time. They do it in universities, for instance. So we've got a ton of these existential threats that are coming up in the short to long term, next 3 to 20 years. And there's some big, bold moves that need to get taken to address all of these things. We have to walk and chew gum, right? All of these things have to be addressed. And it seems daunting, and it seems especially daunting because things move so slow, and people are so reticent to take big, bold actions.
Yeah, there was a Chinese nationalist that was arrested in 2020, I think. That was a professor in Harvard.
I'm sure there was. I mean, there was at least one in the news in the last week.
Really?
In fact, I think there was a major newspaper article in, I don't know, it was Wall Street Journal or Atlantic or one of these big names, just in the last 48 hours, identifying the Chinese method of elite capture at universities in order to basically take our intellectual property and also to set up for potential sabotage operations on U.S. soil.
And that's one of the big problems with Amazon right now is a lot of the stuff that they're selling on Amazon is actually copyright infringement.
Sure, and that's a major economic hardship. It's been very difficult, to my understanding, to start a small manufacturing type business with any sort of unique product in the last 10 to 20 years, because immediately it's reverse engineered, because a lot of the times it's being made in China in the first place, so they already know how to do it, and then they just sell off-brand versions of it and they pocket the cash.
Yeah, we have a lot of military equipment that's made there too.
Oh, that's a big problem.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
You wouldn't think so, which unfortunately I've been a little bit out of the loop, so I haven't seen everything that's happening. So if I make a mistake in this, forgive me, but I don't love what I've just seen. One of the very few things I don't like from our current administration, this idea that they're going to take a plane from Doha or Qatar and use it in an Air Force One capacity. It just seems like just a glaring
That's a bad idea.
Counterintelligence nightmare.
Yeah, well, I did see that it wouldn't be active for another 4 years.
Well, that's a start.
Yeah.
But, man, it can be, I mean...
It's a bad idea.
It was hard to detect every bug, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Today, I don't know how you would even go about that.
We got to assume that all the phones that are coming from China have some sort of backdoor system.
Oh, sure. Sure.
They'd be dumb not to do it.
Yeah. Phones, TVs. Recently, there was a artificial intelligence robot dog, I believe it was. And I think the idea was they were going to use this in some kind of a law enforcement or search and rescue type capacity, and they found there was a hardware backdoor built in for the Chinese company to be able to control it. And they've already weaponized it over in China. So there's bad stuff like that on the horizon that's coming that we're going to need to deal with, which is why I do like to give credit to the administration right now. Some of the things I do like I'm seeing, a lot of people don't love the tariffs. I love a lot of the economic stuff that's happening right now because there are national security implications, and we need to bring some of this manufacturing back here at a minimum to cut off these angles of attack on our country and our leadership.
The potential for them.
Right.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Because you're pretty much leaving ourselves vulnerable.
Very.
And then the last time that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, they were trying to eliminate TikTok and Yahweh.
Yes.
And the reason why is because of the influence that it has, I would assume, because the way that it's manufactured over there, how the content that's shown to their youth is a lot different than the content that's shown to ours.
Sure. When it comes to Huawei, Huawei was an obvious problem. Backdoor gave them access to critical infrastructure. They could do a lot of damage to us. And the only way to describe TikTok as it exists here is a information warfare operation against America's youth.
Yeah.
There's really no other way to describe what they're doing with this. It's totally different content that you see on the Chinese version. It's educational content and stuff that you would want kids to learn. Here it is purposely destroying culture and degrading children. So I wish they would have shut it down. I'm not pleased that they gave them an extension. They should have just shut the thing down.
Would you call that one of the short-term existential threats to America right now?
Sort of. That's just one facet of one of the existential threats. So, like the China angle, generally speaking, the threat posed by the old Soviet communist bloc countries, the Latin American socialist countries, they all kind of come together and they work together toward a lot of ends. So I would say collectively they do represent an existential threat in a couple different ways. The immigration front, their access to our critical infrastructure, the fact that they have, Mexico is basically it's cartel more or less run, right? But who runs the cartels? Well, they basically operate at the pleasure of the Chinese Communist Party.
A lot of the drugs that they're sending are coming from China.
Right. So China more or less controls Mexico by proxy. And unfortunately, even worse now since the recent election they've had, China's coming to control Canada as well through their elite capture of politicians. So that's another threat that's on our horizon as we have unfriendly governments.
In Canada.
Canada, yes.
Which is run by the Crown.
I wouldn't say it's run by the Crown. There's certainly influence there, and there is certainly a form of allegiance there. But if you look at the direction that the Canadians, the elites in Canada, and those who've run things have gone, they've done an awful lot at the behest of the Chinese, including, for instance, just a year or two ago, having Chinese military for winter warfare training in Canada.
I remember that.
Recently, I forget his name, the most recent premier or president or whatever they have in Canada, is very deeply and closely aligned with China.
Trudeau was,
but this new gentleman, Carney, I believe it is even more deeply
I don't know what
aligned.
His name is. Yeah.
He was he was really big in the ESG movement. Really big. By the way, the whole ESG movement. It's a cartel designed to help turn the Western economies into the same thing that China kind of became, which is a sort of communist-fascist, closed ideological system with just enough free markets to thrive.
Now, the ESG, what does that stand for?
Environmental, social, and governmental. It's a scoring system, basically.
And is that through the World Economic Forum as well?
Well, they've been a big proponent of it, but it's not just through them. It's a cartel mechanism. So ESG is something where they've controlled access to capital. So banks, they won't allow them to get access to money, companies that is, unless they get a certain ESG score. And the big banks, what would you call them? The Federal Reserve banks here, but also the world banks,
central banks,
exactly, were really pivotal in getting this whole ESG thing off the ground. And the current guy who just got elected in Canada, Carney, I believe his name is, was fundamental to that process. He was really deeply involved. He is a Davos type, integrated with the World Economic Forum, the UN, and all of these entities are working sort of hand in glove with China and the Chinese communists.
If you said Davos 15 years ago, people just said it didn't exist.
Yeah, it was a weird thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a whole, the timeline from, it doesn't exist to actually it exists and it's a good thing is really shortened in recent years.
And even when something comes out now, they'll say, "Oh, that's nothing, that doesn't exist." The time frame for it to become real is, like you said, it's gotten shorter, and then all the criticism of it before just disappears, and then they just the media will just say, "Well, it's not as bad as what they were saying. They do this, but the idea of what you were talking about, a lot of that has to do with stakeholder capitalism as well."
Yeah, stakeholder capitalism is really an interesting concept because who are stakeholders, right? It's not the idea of, so first of all, what is capitalism? And this is where a lot of people don't like what I have to say about it, but capitalism doesn't actually exist, right? There's this thing that people do naturally called trading, like I have something you want, you have something I want, or I need something from you. So we work out a mutually beneficial arrangement, we trade, right? And you take those interactions en masse and you build out what is called an economy, right? People working together toward what they need, what they want. Capitalism, however, was a term coined by communists within the realm of Marxist theory. And it wasn't actually a description of what I just said. It was actually a straw man of that system, where they built up this fake thing that doesn't really exist. And they insert this idea of this magical property called capital that self-perpetuates and creates this class of people who are unable to break out of this this sort of prison system. So they keep perpetuating capitalism. So the word capitalism is just shot through with these weird esoteric sort of theological implications that it's not a real thing.
It's a boogeyman.
It is. It's a boogeyman. So, and it's impossible to adopt that term properly without feeding into their arguments. So the other side of this is the stakeholder part. Who are the stakeholders, right? Well, it actually looks a lot like what the Soviets did, because the word Soviet actually means council,
Yeah.
Right. So a Soviet council would get together, stakeholders, and decide how the market's going to run, which is basically exactly what they're saying ought to happen with stakeholder capitalism. You've got this idea where they're going to centrally plan it. These elites are going to get together who know better than everyone else, and they're going to plan what happens with production.
The
and
experts.
they're going to manufacture incentives and disincentives to try to steer people in certain directions. And that is a very, very ugly thing. It's been tried before. People have done it before, and it creates really nightmarish conditions.
Yeah. The argument against it, against saying that, is that it's a logical fallacy. That's one thing I've been told, is that real communism hasn't been tried.
Yeah. Well, when part of that's like saying, if I defined water as a clear beverage that when I drink it, it makes me immortal, and I kept drinking sips of water and I never became immortal, I could be like, well, I've never tried real water before. When the definition of success is built in, or when success is built into the definition of communism, and it's never succeeded,
Right.
Of course it's never been tried before. It's never succeeded before. It can't. It's fundamentally opposed to the reality. So that's why they say it's never been tried before. It's because it's never worked before.
Right. So I would say over the last 5 years, I've read more about communism than I ever have.
Yeah, me too.
And there's a book by Richard Pipes called The Russian Revolution, and he talks about the revolution pretty much starting back in 1905 because they had all these big demonstrations in the schools, and that's when the government started really losing control because they would just give more and more leeway to these demonstrations because they thought it looked unpopular to crack down on them, which gave that movement more and more power.
Yeah.
They more and more momentum, and eventually they just ended up having the Tsar step down, and all hell broke loose.
Yeah. And mind you, I haven't read that particular work, and I've read less about the history of the events of communism than communist theory. But the reality is that every communist revolution in history is just some version of the French Revolution.
Yeah. Yep. I think the Cambodian one was probably one of the most brutal.
I think so.
They eliminated something like a third of their population, and
Yep.
the stories that came out of that were just horrific.
Oh yeah.
And it was when they started in the capital, the communists came into the capital and they said, the Americans are coming. You have 2 hours. You have to get out of here. You can come back once they're done bombing us. And so everybody packed up all their things and started marching towards the jungle. And the guy who wrote it, I think it was Hang Nor was his name. He said after about a day, we knew that they were just lying to us. So it was their version of 14 days to stop the spread.
Oh yeah.
And they just marched them further into the jungle. And the people that were participating in it, the guerrillas that were involved in it, he said that when you would have conversations with them, they wouldn't know what communism was. They didn't know what capitalism was. They were poor, they were angry.
Oh yeah.
And they were able to capitalize on that to get them to do horrific things.
And I wouldn't be surprised if they were in some manner considered foreign as well, because it's been a habit of tyrants going all the way back past Aristotle, and Aristotle described this. Tyrants like to import foreign hordes to oppress their own people, because tyrants don't make claims against them that their own people do, and they can use them as muscle and to divide the people.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty scary.
Yep.
And now we have unchecked immigration, illegal immigration that's been going on for the last 4 years, probably
Sure.
longer actually.
It's a real problem. And I mean, I know there's a lot of different numbers out there, but the people that I pay attention to, the ones involved in really looking at this, suggest that the numbers of illegals in our country is probably more to the order of 30 to 40 million than 10.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of people.
And I thought I've heard something like 15 million just in the last 4 years.
I wouldn't be surprised at all.
And before that, they thought there were 15 to 20 million before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Democrats used to be very, very, very strict on immigration when they were considered the working class party.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when they had to come back to the sort of working class, when they had to win that vote, when they were looking at losing power in the long term, they had to swing back to the blue collar sort of. It's the same switch we see actually happening right now. You'll notice. I mean, for years and years, they've pushed the neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism stuff, like the culture wars, as people call it. But right now, and for the last number of months, they've been making a hard transition back to economic Marxism, back to pressing the difference, the oppressor-oppressed dialectic based on the poor and the rich, right? They've been pushing those buttons. So they do that every now and then. And as a part of that, sometimes they will, adopt certain tactics or certain policy positions that would seem to, be along those lines, including under, like Clinton, for instance, restricting immigration. But historically, I mean, go back to the Democrats of the early 20th century, and most of them were reasonably open borders types. They were international revolutionary types. The young Hegelians, the early progressives. At least with the rest of the communist bloc, they would have loved to have pure open borders, even then.
Do you consider yourself libertarian at all?
I would often fall under the sort of banner of small L libertarianism, but I do not consider myself libertarian. The reasons for which are somewhat complicated, but it basically gets into what do libertarians kind of fundamentally believe? What are their presuppositions? Where is their stuff coming from? And their sort of ideas are fundamentally based in these things like the NAP, the non-aggression principle, for instance, which I got to be honest is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard, because no two libertarians can agree on what it means. Whereas I'm purely coming from a sort of Christian background, Christian ethics. So
do to others as you'd want done to you.
Yes, in a manner of speaking, but within the right context. Yes, I mean, the way I view it is take the whole thing, the whole scriptures as a whole, and you have to understand them contextually in the situations they were in, and realize that in a fallen world there are sometimes times for things to go other than would be optimal. I mean, just the idea of self-defense, for instance. Like, you don't love the fact that you have to hurt somebody in a self-defense situation, but you are justified and you ought to ethically do that if you're put in that situation, right? Because God values human life.
Okay. So in the scripture, you probably know more about it than I do. I can say you definitely know more about it than I do. When Jesus is apprehended and he doesn't defend himself, mm-hmm. Where does that lie as far as self-defense?
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, you don't hear interesting questions like that very often. So actually, contextually, in that moment, Christ said something important, and I'll paraphrase here, but he said, "If the source of my kingdom was of this world, then we would be fighting now. But the source of his kingdom is not of this world. The source of his kingdom is a supernatural kingdom. It's a heavenly kingdom." So on that basis, first, there was no reason to fight, because fighting is not how you advance the kingdom of Christ, not by the sword. Second, contextually, in order to fulfill the prophecies, Christ had to die. And that was when he was taken into captivity. That's when I believe it was Peter lobbed off some poor Roman's ear, and Jesus healed him. And it wasn't that Christ in that moment rebuked him, but he didn't rebuke him because he had a weapon or because he was acting in a defensive capacity. He was rebuking him because he knew this had to happen, and he was trying to stop the prophecy from being fulfilled in that moment, which was wrong.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So Christians do have the right to defend themselves then.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at what else Christ said. I mean, when Christ realized, when he was not going to be with his people anymore, and he was going to be sending his disciples out to the nations to preach his word and to tell people about the good news, he told them, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy a sword. And why do you have a sword? You don't use a sword to put butter on bread. You use a sword defensively or offensively, potentially, but we know that it wasn't meant to be offensively because one of his disciples said back to him, sir, we have 3 swords. And Christ said, that's enough. Okay, you don't need an army worth of swords because we're not going to conquer things with the sword. You just need enough to defend yourself and to protect the innocent.
I like that.
Yep.
So your views on communism and collectivism, do you think that's the driving force that made you want to run for state rep?
Yeah, that was a significant part of it. I was really getting into theory and strategy and trying to figure out how we fix this whole situation. And because this situation goes way beyond just the realm of politics, it goes into culture.
Yeah.
And it goes into just everything is implicated. But I was writing about politics at the time and strategy, and I had some people talk to me, and they encouraged me to consider it, and I did. I decided, okay, I'll go and I'll see what I can do. I'll try to affect some of the strategy I've been writing myself in the State House and see how it goes.
And what is some of that strategy?
So some of it, for instance, is, well, let me paint the big picture real quick to help you understand.
Okay.
The way I see it, politicians are going to do things for one of only a couple different reasons. There's not a ton of different reasons. Either they think it's ethically good according to whatever their beliefs are, okay? Somebody is greasing the skids to make it happen. Okay, so some favor is being done or some other thing is happening to get them to do it. Or they are socially afraid of the implications of not doing it. Okay. That third item is the playground of the neo-Marxists since their strategist Gramsci and the Frankfurt School understood the social mechanisms that cause people to fear taboo. Like a lot of the things that people might otherwise do that they don't do because there's a taboo around it and they're afraid of the social repercussions. So I started thinking to myself, well, if there's 3 ways primarily that politicians do things, and one of those ways is really quite bad. It's favors, it's money, it's something greasing the skids, right? And that's a bad reason to do things. It's unethical, and it's also not sustainable from our viewpoint because we, as the resistance here, don't have access to a ton of resources. So we can't go greasing the skids of all these politicians to make things happen, right? So we're left with 2 approaches. We're left with the approach of appealing to ethics and teaching proper ethics that lead them to these conclusions that we need to do things for good reasons, or they need to be fearful of the social consequences for not doing it. So I began enacting both those 2 planks, both teaching ethics and helping to explain why we need to do certain things the way we need to do them, and also taboo making, establishing negative social consequences for bad behavior and doing the wrong thing. People really don't like the second one, but it is a wholly necessary function of any society. Think of pedophiles, right? We don't want pedophiles in our schools. There was a real concerted effort to try to normalize pedophilia over the last perhaps 10 years. One of the biggest reasons it didn't get normalized is because of online meme making, where people normalize the idea of doing terrible things to pedophiles.
Memes are a powerful thing.
Memes are a very powerful thing. So we kept this concept of pedophilia way outside of normalization. We kept it very stigmatized, very taboo, which is good and necessary. And we need to be creating more taboo around very bad things because lots of very bad things happening.
Do you think that that's just in our area? Because in California, they've passed certain laws that make it easier for pedophiles.
Yeah, there's and these are the state differences, right? There's always going to be different social circumstances in different places. And California has a long, unfortunate history of leaning toward these cultish beliefs.
And that's the culture aspect of things.
It does. I mean,
So what you're talking about.
the word culture comes from cult, actually. So
Oh, really?
it lines up pretty good. But yes, that's exactly right. And we need more taboo making, and it's going to be more difficult to affect that in some places like California than others. It's actually not that easy in New Hampshire because we're very freewheeling, and libertarians, God love them, and I get along with them way more often than not, but they do not like taboo.
No.
They very much want everything, more or less everything, to kind of be okay.
Yeah. That's pretty much been where I've kind of fallen away from the libertarians, is that I know that there's been some libertarians that have been pro like hormone blockers and sex change operations for minors, which, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if you're an adult and you're paying for it for yourself, like, people can kind of do what they want to do. I don't think you can really legislate morality.
I would take a different tact. I think if you're doing it right, you can only legislate morality.
That's it.
Because I mean, think about murder.
Yeah.
Why do we legislate murder? Well, it's immoral, right? Why do we legislate against rape? It's immoral.
But there's victims with those too, where somebody does go for a sex change operation on their own free will. They're doing it to themselves.
You're correct that it is a little bit of a more complicated situation. My argument would be, we don't let people cut limbs off because they feel like they might be better off with a limb.
Not yet.
Not yet. I mean, actually, I've heard in some places they have. But the idea is that in order to make a competent decision in your own best interest for yourself, you have to have a sort of baseline level of agency you're working with, right? And this is a very fraught area because it's really easy to go too far in one direction or the other. So it can be difficult to do right. But my take is, you're actually going to just cut perfectly healthy pieces off yourself. It's prima facie evidence that you don't have the mental agency at the moment to be making such a mental decision.
Yeah,
on the other side of the coin, you've got doctors who are supposed to be following the first fundamental principle of do no harm.
Right.
So ethically, doctors ought to be refusing to do such a thing.
But they're not.
But they're not,
And
in many cases, because a whole different set of ethics has been imported into the American psyche, based not on any sort of Christian background, but on a very esoteric, the same background as Marxism. It's the same. In one of my side things, I run a small business doing educational videos and whatnot. The next video and the last video I put out, I'm beginning to make the case that the most fundamental distinction in the world right now in human culture is actually the distinction between Athens and Jerusalem. It's the difference between the ancient Greek metaphysics and the Christian metaphysics. And that's really what's ultimately behind all of the issues we're seeing crop up, every single one of them. For instance, you talked about the whole hormone replacement, sex change. Well, guess what? According to the beliefs of the Platonists, so going from the works of Plato, works such as Symposium, Timaeus, Republic, going through the works and how those have been interpreted over time, it gave rise to the religion called Hermeticism, which gave rise to the Gnostic heresy. Within that creation myth, it's actually said that mankind was created both male and female. That man was male and female, two faces, one on each side of the head, 4 arms, 4 legs, rolled around. And actually that these creatures got full of themselves and attempted to take on the gods, ascending Mount Olympus. And Zeus struck them, splitting them in 2. And I believe there was something about this happened in the 7th generation, that men and women were split. So now you're one person, one face, 2 arms, 2 legs. Part of this religion, actually the fundamental part of this religion, is about transcending distinctions. So the less distinctions you have, the closer you are to the absolute act, or closer you become to God. At the end of history, they believe that all will return to God. Okay. So part of their religious duty is to transcend distinctions. Male and female is a distinction. They've actually worshipped hermaphrodites for thousands of years because they transcend the distinction of male-female. They are one step closer to becoming one with God, according to their crazy theology. Okay. Which is, by the way, the word hermaphrodite is the word Hermes, hermeticism, plus Aphrodite.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have that worldview and if you're working from that set of ethical presuppositions, even if you don't inherently know all of them, but you've just kind of picked them up socially because this is the milieu we're in, it actually wouldn't be a bad thing to cut the genitals off of a kid or add another part, because you're transcending distinctions, which brings them one step closer to God. And that can't be a bad thing, right?
So is that related to Ishtar?
I'm not familiar with Ishtar.
That was a god that is actually, I believe she's the same. It's the same idea where there's no male, female. She had another, like her counterpart was also the same.
Sure.
And it goes back to Mother Kybele.
Okay.
Which it predates Greece, I want to say.
It could. I mean, I don't specifically know those ones. I do know that
it's happened multiple. It's
sure,
happened for thousands of years.
It absolutely has.
Idea, and it's not just
no
linked to the Greeks.
Well, the Greeks said they got it from ancient Egypt,
right? Which was
and Egypt certainly traveled to the east, and their ideas, you see them.
Yeah,
in the east as well.
It starts out, I believe, with Mother Kybele, which goes back to like something like 30 or 40,000 years.
Wow.
And so,
well, technically, they make the same claim of Hermes Trismegistus and his emerald tablets, even though it was probably written more like the 1st or 2nd century.
Okay,
but
I've read the book The Return of the Gods, and it goes through a lot of that.
Interesting.
It talks about people pretty much leaving Christianity and going back, just like you're saying, back to these old ways, these old gods that believe in those very same things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And if you trace it far enough back and if you take seriously what the Bible has to say about some of this stuff, you might wonder if that wasn't the meaning of what happened at the Tower of Babel and God confusing the languages.
Never thought of it like that. Yeah.
Well, there's a reason they call it Mystery Babylon.
So, it was Nimrod who built the Tower of Babel, right?
I believe it was.
Yeah. I have a buddy that's writing a book about that.
Nice.
And he goes back into all of that. So we've talked about that quite a bit, going back to Mother Kybele and all the way into the Bible. And then you have Nimrod being the great hunter, and the Tower of Babel and all that. And it's really interesting stuff. Like, for somebody to get into that, and I mean, I've looked into it, and I'm definitely not well versed on it whatsoever.
Not many are. It's hard to get into this stuff, and so it's hard to get into it not just because it's weird stuff, but because the people who have historically documented this stuff over the centuries or longer, they're purposely syncretic, meaning they purposely adopt other systems into their own systems. So they mix and match stuff up all the time, and they're also horrible liars. And they lie about stuff all the time, and it's in their books. So you read a book like one of the best books I've read documenting the history of this kind of stuff, even though the guy's an awful author, I forget his name, is The Secret Teachings of All Ages.
Okay.
Difficult book. But it helps to get into the mindset of what these people have, been doing for the last 1,000+ years and what they've been thinking. And how they've transmitted this stuff down, because it's not like, Christianity, you go to a church, right? And it's all out in the open. Anybody can come into the church. They can listen to the sermon. They can hear what's going on. But these things that they do, their theological level stuff, their training, there's a reason they call it a mystery.
Mystery schools,
right? They don't do this stuff all out in the open for everyone. And the stuff they put in the open for everyone is not always true to what is happening behind closed doors.
They want misinformation.
Exactly. They'll feed you disinformation in order to create sort of a cult of an atmosphere that they have special knowledge, right? They don't actually have special knowledge. What they do is they have these little groups that get together and they make agreements to support each other. And then they go out and they use tactics to take over institutions or companies or whatever, and they do each other favors. And the favors that they do each other, which are awful ethically, by the way, create the image like they have special powers somehow. They're getting this stuff done that nobody knows. How do they get this stuff done? They have connections. They have special connections to other people who are willing to do bad, unethical things to advance their own self-interest. Meanwhile, they feed nonsense to the rest of the world about what's going on.
And these are the cabals that people think control the world.
Cabals, right. You know where the word cabal comes from?
Cannibals. Cannibals, right?
No, cabal comes from Kabbalah.
Kabbalah.
Kabbalah Christian, Kabbalah Judaism. It comes from...
They worship Baal, right? Is that...
Well, I mean, there might be some of that in there. But Kabbalah was an esoteric book that brought these cult teachings and syncretized them into some version of other religions, such as Christianity and Judaism. And what they would do is they would do what I just said, right? They do special favors for each other and feed the rest of the outside world nonsense, and they make it look like they have special powers, which is where the word cabal developed from. It's when these people get together and start doing this secret stuff.
See, I thought it had something to do with cannibals.
No, not this one.
I thought it was the Canaanites that were eating children that worship Baal.
I'm familiar with those stories, but I'm not familiar with any association to the word cabal in that.
I could be wrong. I'm not very well versed in all this.
It happens.
That's why it's good to talk to smart people.
I just read a lot.
Yeah. So what have you read that's probably been the most influential on the way that you think?
Well, that would be the Bible.
Yeah. Next to that.
But after that would be various commentaries on the Bible. But after that would be the stuff the enemy writes.
Okay.
Starting with the works of Plato, which really lays a lot out.
Plato?
Oh, yeah, Plato. Plato was the guy who first put in writing all this nasty stuff.
Really?
Like, for instance, if you read his book, Republic,
yes,
you're going to see so much of what has happened over the last decade. He talked about how in order to develop a new national ethos within a culture, within a country, and jettison the old one, you had to create a total break between two generations. The parents couldn't be allowed to transmit their beliefs and their culture to their children.
That's like 1984.
1984 is, the Fabians, right? And the Fabians were Neoplatonists. That's where all this stuff comes from.
Okay.
Plato was the one who brought it from Egypt and put it in writing.
Okay.
Well, I guess you could say Socrates, technically, because he was the one he was writing about. But Plato was the one who documented this stuff. He documented this is where communism comes from. This is where fascism comes from. This is where the Nazism came from. Nazism is just a more spiritual interpretation of this stuff. It's where modern Common Core and social emotional learning comes from.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I've never heard that.
There's a straight line from the works of Plato through the rise of esotericism in Arabian countries when it fell out of favor in the Greek area. Then it transmitted in the Dark Ages to Europe, where it became very popular. The Corpus Hermeticum was translated and became very popular among the powerful in Europe. They started making little secret societies and went all over the place. And guess which two guys grew up in a bastion of these secret societies based in Platonism? Hegel and Marx.
Okay. They
both grew up steeped in this stuff.
Okay. I've never heard that.
Oh, yeah. It's just in different flavors of the weird Platonic religion.
So I've listened to the Republic while I was working, but never made those connections.
Oh, there's nasty stuff in there.
Really?
Oh yeah. You want to get more nasty stuff? Don't read it before dinner. Symposium.
Plato's
Symposium is all about how they These, by the way, so Plato's books are all written as dialogues, right? For the most part. And they're dialogues between oligarchs, people who are in high tier control of society. Their normal laws more or less don't apply to them. They get to do what they want. The world's their playground. So you get a bunch of guys, oligarchs, the world's their playground. And one of the things they love doing is preying on young boys. Talking about how the Greeks have to send, the wealthy Greeks have to send their little children out with chaperones to make sure they're not abducted by Socrates and his people.
That's in that.
And it's in Symposium.
Oh, wow.
And how the commoners would hang them if they knew the full truth about what they were up to. And it's a whole dialogue on justifying pederasty and trying to raise it to an enlightened level. But just between the lines, just barely between the lines. You don't have to read much into it to understand that what these people are talking about is binding themselves together in a blackmail type agreement that will allow them to operate more efficiently as oligarchs, controlling a lot of different things and in a revolutionary manner against the system that pre-existed them. And that idea of using pederasty or pedophilia among oligarch types to use as blackmail type material and bonding material for these groups. I mean, what do you think Epstein was up to?
Ghislaine Maxwell's father. He was doing that in Canada.
And the MI6 did that in the Kincora Boys Home in Northern Ireland, right? Mm-hmm. This stuff is not new. It's been going on for thousands of years.
And it's put in a lot of the pop culture, too.
Yeah.
The same guy that wrote all the MI6 books, he also wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And then Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that they would just hide it in plain sight.
Well, that's exactly what they do. They hide it in plain sight, and Plato created an open secret society to transmit this stuff. You know what it was called?
What?
The Academy.
The Academy?
The Academy functioned as an open secret society to teach people to utilize these strategies and doctrines that Plato said they got from ancient Egypt that effectively function as a perverse and nasty control mechanism for oligarchs. Then you talk about, you go further and talk about how both Plato and Aristotle described democracy. They knew it was an awful thing. They knew democracy was unstable. It was revolutionary. They knew that it didn't last long because somebody would wind up taking power because people are so easily controlled. And if you look at the word demos of democracy today, you'll find the people. But in their time, demos did not mean the people. Demos means certain groups of people. So you have this group over here with these certain interests. And this group over here with this certain interest. So when you actually break it down, what the word demos means in democracy is identity politics.
Really?
Yes.
Huh.
Demos is identity politics.
Yeah, for me, democracy is mob rule from what I've read about it, but you've gone so far deep, so much deeper into it.
It is in theory mob rule, but even beyond that, what are mobs?
Groups of people.
And how easy are they to control?
Pretty easy.
Especially when you divide them.
Yeah.
If you can divide mobs and put them on each other, you can keep them that way, you can control the demos of democracy as an oligarch and keep yourself in control really control of things behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they've been doing for a very long time. And that's what the whole move to normalize the concept of democracy to America has been. Because guess what? America was founded against democracy. It's in our Federalist Papers. You can hear the arguments. We understood that democracy was not a good or desirable thing. A republic is a good system, or at least it's a better system, designed to deal with the problems of factions, so you don't wind up with certain groups of people fighting other groups of people for improper privilege.
I used to think Thomas Jefferson, a lot more highly about Thomas Jefferson, but the more I learned about him in the French Revolution, his support for the French Revolution, it really started making me second guess him a little more.
Yeah, I mean, these guys, even when they were good, they weren't perfect.
Right.
I think my favorite is probably George Washington, but he wasn't perfect. Right.
Right.
There's errors involved, but one of my favorite points to bring up on this one is that they will say that, well, I mean, they must have liked democracy because there was a Democratic Republican Party at the founding, right? Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. That's nonsense. There was no Democratic Party at the founding of this nation. They knew democracy was not a good thing. The word Democratic Republican was added retroactively about a century after the fact.
Really?
They were called the Jeffersonian Republicans, not the Democratic Republicans. It was a retroactive normalization of the concept of democracy that didn't arise. The whole idea of democracy didn't arise until the Democratic Party in, I forget the year off the top of my head, like 1840 or something. I have to go back and look. But it was not a normal concept. At the founding of this nation, the founders knew that democracy was not a very good thing. But there's always interests, oligarchs, who would like to exploit things. And they understand that you can exploit a democracy because you can exploit the demos by dividing them at each other. You can't exploit a republic the same way because a republic doesn't create the kind of spoils that you can, like the whole idea of democracy, two wolves and a sheep voting for what's for dinner. That's basically how this works. You create special privileges among certain groups, and you set the groups at each other to fight over those spoils. In a republic, you're not supposed to generate those spoils in the first place, so there's nothing to fight over. Everybody's supposed to be free to do the best they can in life. But democracy went and got normalized, and that wasn't good. We've now got to undo that.
Yeah, that's a really pretty good take. Like I've never heard anybody really talk about it like you have, like in that flow. What did you think? What do you think of the John Adams? As far as we're talking about.
I mean,
founding fathers.
They all had good and bad. Adams is a hard guy to pin down too, because on one hand, like, you know, right before the Revolution, he's defending the British, talking about the necessity of a defense and impartiality and making sure everyone has that benefit. And then in his presidency, the Alien Sedition Acts.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, wait a second.
Yeah.
Where something changed in there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. On the other hand, we have now seen in this country especially over the last 80 years, what happens when a country no longer takes seriously existential threats. Like sedition, actual sedition, that's an existential threat to a country. A country can't survive a multitude of seditious conspiracies that are allowed to just take root. And yet the last people we executed in this country were the Rosenbergs.
What year was that?
I believe that was in the 50s.
Okay. It's not taken seriously anymore.
And we have traitors. We have had people convicted, and they get slaps on the wrist.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, this seditious conspiracy against America that has brought us to this point, this slow-moving revolution toward democracy, away from Republican government, which, by the way, Republican government is guaranteed in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. The federal government is required to guarantee to each state a Republican form of government. It's right there. That's the nature of American government. But no, democracy got normalized in this slow-moving, long march program. And even today, I mean, just in my other on the business side of things, I've been going through some tweets, or what do we call them since Twitter's technically
X's.
gone? X's. It's a weird way to say it.
Posts.
Whatever. Posts. By various, colleges. And these colleges are touting their plans to do things like degrowth. Like, climate change is an existential threat, so we basically need to really slow down growing food.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
Okay, so you're talking about, let's just be real about what you're talking about. You're talking about starving people over a communist conspiracy. Because climate change is a bunch of nonsense, all right? Now, maybe the climate's changing a bit. Maybe people even have a hand in that to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, It's probably not catastrophic.
I always thought a better argument, if you're really concerned about the environment, get everybody on board with not polluting, not throwing trash in the ocean, finding more biodegradable products that we can introduce.
I mean, if we want to talk solutions, there's if indeed it's a real problem, there's big solutions.
Do you think that these people want solutions?
No.
No,
they're foot soldiers out on the streets. Most of them, they want solutions, but they don't. They're operating at a low level. The ones creating the strategy don't want solutions, right? The Comintern and the Soviets were deeply responsible for anti-nuclearization movements in the U.S. that normalized, ironically, irony of ironies, they managed to get us to shut down our nuclear future based on their own nuclear malfeasance at Chernobyl. They made such a mess of things with a bad system, and they used that to convince us to shoot ourselves in the foot when we had the capability all along to do this pretty safely.
A few years ago, I bought Bill Gates's book on the environment. I still haven't read it, but when I was checking out, there was an 18-year-old girl that was working at the bookstore.
Yeah.
And she said something along the lines of how more people need to be alarmed about it. And I said, when I was your age, Al Gore was telling us that there'd be no ice in the North Pole, and there's still ice on the North Pole.
Yeah, he was telling us that polar bears were going to die off, and then before that, they were telling us it was going to get too cold and we were all going to freeze to death.
And her response was, it doesn't matter if it's true, if we have to lie about it to get things done.
Well, I mean, look at what was her name? That
Thunberg.
Thunberg, that Northern European girl who, right up until her 18th birthday, she was all, climate change, climate change, climate change. And as soon as she got out into the world, now it's, I just want communism.
Yeah.
I just want communism.
Yep.
Well, I mean, that's just the mask off right there. That's the whole point of opposing the nuclear, revolution. That was so many front organizations were funded by the Soviets, like SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which morphed into Peace Action, which now is New Hampshire Peace Action, and I believe they're involved in some seditious conspiracy. And I brought that information to our Attorney General. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. But these people are fighting against our prosperous future. They're fighting and they're doing that for a number of reasons. Obviously, from the Soviet front, the Soviets, they always wanted to take America down, right? We were their primary geopolitical foe. But even within America, it was the policy. I'm trying to remember which one it was. It might have been Theodore Adorno of the Frankfurt School, who wrote about the fact that the communist revolutions, didn't happen as Marx predicted, right? He expected the late capitalist West was going to be the first to go communist, and then it was the Bolsheviks in this backwoods Russia who actually did it. So everything got retooled, and they realized what he realized to update their theory to make it work. And I say theory, it's actually more like prophecy. To update their prophecy to make it workable, they said, well, actually, because we solved the problem of production and gave people relatively good lives, and part of that was cracking down on monopolies, by the way. We gave people decent lives. The middle class was no longer a revolutionary force. They don't want a revolution. They want to raise their families and to have a nice life. Well, they can't have that. So they started adopting policies like Francis Fox Piven to destroy our system.
And what is that?
Overload it. The Cloward-Piven strategy.
Okay.
The Cloward-Piven strategy was basically, now that we've got all these kind of social programs that kind of fix some of these problems, well, we got to break these programs because we have to, the middle class has to become revolutionary again in order for the revolution to actually happen, is what they believe. So we're going to overload the system until it breaks. So they've been simultaneously pursuing this, expanding the system and also overloading the system, which that also plays into immigration. They've been pursuing that since, I think they wrote that framework in the 60s.
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
I never read into it. I think it was in the 60s. And you said the Frankfurt School?
Yeah, the Frankfurt School, aka the Institute for Social Research. It was a bunch of German communists who came over, just before the rise of Hitler, and they came to America, and they reestablished their Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research at Columbia University, and a couple other places also, like Berkeley and some other schools were involved. But this was where they retooled Marx's theory. Because, again, this is actually a religion. Marx was a theologian. He was making prophecy. And when his prophecy failed, everybody kind of went back to the drawing board. And they went in different directions with it, right? So the Frankfurt Schoolers who came here, they went in the direction that created neo or cultural Marxism. They took these ideas about capitalism, that capital is this magical property that reproduces itself and affects the consciousness of those who have it, and they just substituted things like whiteness or whatever else into that category. Like whiteness is this, where white supremacy perpetuates itself, and it's a special property that only certain people have.
So it's been inserting identity politics.
Right, and they call it critical theories, right? Well, when Marx's prophecies failed, they went in one direction with it. Other people went in other directions, like Mussolini and Gentili in Italy. They decided to go in a nationalistic direction with it, and they crafted fascist theory, which was just a response to Marx's failed prophecy.
And the communists will call that the right.
Yeah, they will call that the right. It's like they fight so much, fascists and communists, because it's their brother and sister. Mm-hmm. That's all it is.
Yeah, my take on it is that they're pretty much the same thing. And when people are saying that, I think it was in 2011 when they started changing the textbooks in the colleges so that socialists and National Socialists were called right wing. And in the 30s, they called them right wing as well, but it depends on what part of the spectrum you're really on.
Well, they've been calling them right wing since the beginning. They even called them right wing in the days of original Antifa in Germany. And the whole right wing, left wing thing is based on the revolutionary French Parliament, where the revolutionaries, the leftists, sat on the left. Mm-hmm. They were the ones who wanted the communist revolution in France. Then the monarchists who didn't want revolution sat on the right. Well, they've been calling fascists right for a very long time, but it's a wrong view of that dichotomy. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
So they consider them to the right. What does that mean? I mean, they have the exact same metaphysics, right? The only difference is they're nationalistic as opposed to international, right? There's not a whole lot of difference there.
So you wouldn't say that communists are more about government controlling all property, where socialists would be more about government controlling all industry?
Well, that's...
And then
once
you start moving more to the right, then you start having less government involvement overall?
No, I think that's a common view, but I think it's an erroneous view.
Okay.
First,
that's always been my view.
First, we have to properly identify communism versus socialism.
Okay.
So both come from Marx's theory.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Marx envisioned 6 stages to history. The last 2 stages are socialism and then communism. The before socialism is capitalism. Okay. So all these words come from Marx's theories. So socialism is the phase in history where people have awakened, they have an awakened consciousness to these, power privilege relationships. And they have to forcibly begin to invert hierarchies, like punish the oppressor, elevate the oppressed. All right. And you have to do it forcibly, like really on purpose. That has to happen under socialism. Communism is the phase where you no longer require force to do that, and it becomes automatic. So communism is like heaven for communists, right? Socialism and communism are the same system. It's just different stages of the same system. So socialism, communism, same thing, just different phase in history.
Would you say that the communism portion of that's more self-imposed?
Well, communism is purely theoretical, and this goes back to a conversation we briefly had before we talked
Right.
on air, which is communism has never been tried because they've never entered heaven. It's never worked. So communism, part of the definition of communism is it works.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it doesn't work, then it's not communism. So communism's never been tried, right?
If you're a communist.
Right.
But if you're not a communist and you're on the outside looking in.
Well, I think the most technically correct way to put it would be communism cannot exist, it's never existed, and most of the real hardcore, like knowledgeable communist theorists know that it can't exist. Because they realize the point of communism and his theory is actually stage 5 socialism, which is revolutionary upheaval and division of the demos against one another, where creates that chaos creates opportunity for new oligarchs to rise. It's a regime change mechanism disguised within a theology, disguised within an economic concept.
Going back to what you were saying of because what I was getting at is that in the gulags, when they would put people in prison, they would get prisoners to pretty much guard themselves.
Yep.
So that's why I was asking if that's what you thought.
As
far as communism is, where it's self-imposing on its own people. Because
right.
I mean, why would millions of people starve and suffer and not do anything to change it when it's such a minority of people that actually control it?
Right. So that's kind of in
that's
theory.
not real communism.
Right.
But it's that's as real as it gets.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what happens. If anytime you enact this theory, that's what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't go any other way. In fact, I think it was James Lindsay who's coined this phrase, and this is a particularly good one. Communism is the advertising department for fascism. That's what you actually get. Because what they'll do is they will hold our system of free, sort of free economics, free exchange, these principles. They'll hold that up against Eden, up an idea of perfection, and say, oh, well, in perfection, you wouldn't even have to work, or this would just come naturally, or whatever. So every time they may have a complaint, they complain against perfection, and they hold our system up to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is their system, their theory of communism, winds up in fascism every single time.
Absolutely.
But we like to confuse theory and practice, right? We'll say, oh, they're two totally distinct things. Well, actually, communism is the theory, fascism is the practice. That's what it looks like. It always looks like that. And it can't look anything different than that. Because that's what happens when you bring that level of central planning, that level of control, and that level of just denying God's basic design for man to be free and orient their lives properly.
Do you think it takes a really well-functioning society to even make it possible for it to happen? Or do you think that there needs to be, because no system's perfect, and if you look at pre-communist Russia, you had basically feudalism in a lot of areas.
Yep.
So it wasn't perfect then, but if you go over to America in the last 100 years, I mean, nothing's been perfect, but it's been pretty good. Where at one point you were able to, like you were saying, the working class doesn't want to have a revolution.
Right, generally
so
speaking.
So they have to
don't.
make that happen.
Correct. And they identified that in writing, by the way, the works of the Frankfurt School. They identified that basically the middle class has it too good, we have to break them. So they become revolutionary again.
In Russia, though, where it wasn't that good, at what point did they start trying to impose that there to eliminate the czars? Because it seemed like pre-World War I, you had you didn't have central banks in every single country. You had a czar, you had a king, you had kingdoms, but those all disappeared after World War I. Not all of them, but most of them. I mean, you still have the British Crown still today. So what was that push in the early 1900s?
So their process that they use, and the process they've used for thousands of years, it becomes easier and more militantly revolutionary the deeper the real divisions in society are. Okay, so you take a place that had things quite badly for very many people, like Tsarist Russia, or back then. It wasn't that hard to get the masses worked up to overthrow. I mean, they were dealing with genuine problems. They had oppression. They didn't have the kind of property rights and the protections that might have mitigated against the revolutionary zeal the communists brought in, which is the real reason that the communist revolutions happened in poor places like China and Russia and not in the West. The divisions were not deep enough in the West to cause these groups to militantly and violently revolt.
The Bolsheviks had a lot of trouble even holding on to power.
Yep.
What about going back to the French Revolution?
The French Revolution was interesting because so much of it was ideological and intellectually led. It was a revolt foremost against Christianity and against God, right? They immediately overturned the relationship with the church and replaced it with a new church. I believe it was the Cult of Reason, I think it was called. And they had the Committee of Public Safety running around and executing people like crazy. It was pure, unmitigated Rousseauian emotionalism run amok. And it wasn't, yes, there would have been poor people involved in the revolution, but it wasn't foremost the poor people who were doing these terrible things. It was actually the intellectual class who was doing this stuff. It was like the trust fund kids type thing.
Just like it was the intelligentsia in
just like it was the
Tsarist Russia.
intelligentsia in Tsarist Russia. Yep. And just like it was a similar class in China.
In Cambodia.
Yeah, Cambodia.
There was the colleges.
Right. So this idea that it's these poor people who are always pushing communism is a lot of nonsense. It has always been the bored upper class that has done these things.
I've read books on communism, and I still don't understand communism.
No.
I don't understand how it happens, how people can, and what happens is large groups of people do horrible things. And I think that there's a disconnect in today's society where people think it couldn't happen here, and it couldn't happen again.
Yeah.
And COVID really showed that people were willing to do things that you wouldn't think Americans would do to other Americans.
It did. People, part of the fallen nature of people is that very many are willing to do very, very terrible things if you give those terrible things even the thinnest veneer of virtue. And that's what COVID did, right? It was about safety, and it was about public health. And they set people loose on each other in a lot of different ways.
And take away any sort of repercussions for it.
And just as a mere curiosity, which might not actually be a mere curiosity, what happened to the national debt during COVID?
Right.
How much money got spent?
A lot.
What did I mention about division and dividing the demos? And who does that? The oligarch class. And it's about securing their position of power, wealth, privilege. So they sat the demos against each other during COVID, and they spent 10, 20 trillion dollars.
Yeah.
That sounds like the same kind of oligarchic behavior that has been happening for thousands of years.
It was probably one of the biggest, it was the most wealth redistribution in such a short amount of time, I think, than we've ever seen.
Yeah, it was, and redistribution from multiple future generations who were going to be footing that bill.
Right now in New Hampshire, there's a huge debate about local control.
Yes, there is, in fact.
And the state in New Hampshire, I forget what it's called. There's a form of government that we have in New Hampshire where the municipalities get their authority from the state legislator.
So what you're talking about is something called Dillon's Rule.
Dillon's Rule.
Dillon's Rule is a Supreme Court or legal interpretation of just the nature of our constitutional system, and it's actually, I believe, the correct view. So, and there's a lot of malfeasance, or not malfeasance. There's a lot of misunderstanding happening here. So we are Dillon's rule. So what we have is, again, the dual sovereignty system. We have state government that is sovereign, and we have federal government that is sovereign. And both are supposed to exist within the sort of bounds of that Constitution that tells them how they are constituted. Well, nowhere in that arrangement is local government. The only way that local government exists at all is that authority is granted by the sovereign, which is the state. So the state it delegates certain authorities to local jurisdictions. So from a purely legal standpoint and from a sort of ethical standpoint, where the way that our government is supposed to function says that the state delegates authority that it believes to be appropriate at any given time, and it can remove authority that it believes to be appropriate at any given time. So there's a lot of people are mixing up this local control argument for the real issue, which is what is being done right or what is being done wrong. And that's where we should be arguing. And I have my own views on that. But this local control thing is kind of a red herring, right? It's clearly the state has the legal authority, and it not only does it have the legal authority, it has the ethical responsibility to step in where the local authority oversteps. For instance, where local authorities were overstepping on forcing kids to wear masks, right?
Right.
Well, that would be an awfully good place for the state to step in and say, no, we're not going to let you do that anymore. And I believe there's a bill that we just passed that should do that, assuming it doesn't get vetoed this time. So that's a good example of the state removing local authority from the locals. So the question becomes, and this has been one of the ugliest fights I've seen in politics recently, around all this zoning and planning, these issues. And one of the reasons it's been so ugly is because there's been so much bad information out there about what's going on. Now, I'm not going to be defending ugly or bad things, ever. I've seen a number of things that I've had serious concerns with in my time in the House. Times when I suspected, remember I talked about the 3 reasons politicians do things. There have been plenty of times I've suspected that maybe behind the scenes somebody's greasing the skids to get something done here. And there's a few times I've voted against stuff purely because I thought, well, looks like a special favor for somebody. And ethically, special favors are partiality, right? We are supposed to be impartial. So I vote against that kind of stuff. But we also have a very real issue when it comes to housing. But even more fundamentally than that, we have the ethical issue of what rights ought people have to property they own, right? What is the bounds on them developing their own property? So these are really fundamental questions that we have a lot of different people answering in different ways because people believe different things, right? So a lot of people have deeply erroneously conflated zoning with contract law. They've conflated the idea of zoning with homeowners associations. Those are two things that ethically cannot be commingled like that. Because on one hand, homeowners association is a contract. Like you're voluntarily entering into a contract. You sign on that dotted line. That gives the state legal authority to arbitrate contract disputes if you break the rules, right? Zoning is a function of government. Government is wielding the sword, right? We use force. We coercively do stuff. So when you have zoning and you only have, you have 51% of people agree with something, if they're restricting the property rights of the 49%, that's not comparable in any way to people voluntarily entering a contract. This is using the power of government to take property away from people, take property rights, right? That is actually, it is functionally democracy.
Yeah.
So that's fundamentally what's at issue. That said, on the other side of this, you've got radical libertarians who will say, "Oh, do anything they want. Do whatever you want." Well, no, that's not right either, because you actually have some fundamental rights to your property, including things like the quiet enjoyment of your property. So if somebody imposes a nuisance on you through their activity, I mean, if you have a pig farm moved next door to you in a suburb, right, you're going to have some nuisance from that, some genuine problems that impact your own, ability to quietly enjoy your own property. So what we have to tease out reasonably, and I wish there was a lot less vitriol because we've gotten so far away from the real issue here. It's absurd. What we have to work out is what are reasonable restrictions that constitute a nuisance that we ought to be restricting. And that might mean taking some authority away from local governments by the state. And we might have to do that because it's the right thing to do. On the other hand, we do like to generally devolve some degree of local control because people ought to have closely answerable politicians to their government, right? That's just a model of good governance. So that's where the issue lies here. There's been a lot of fighting about proxy issues in this thing. So a lot of people have made what I consider to be a really pretty wicked moral argument that says that if we zone to make more affordable, like smaller homes in our town, we're going to attract young families. And young families are going to produce children. And those children are probably going to utilize the local schools, and that could be a driver on our property taxes. So therefore, we are doing an okay thing if we purposely zone to exclude young families by preventing those kind of homes from being built here. I think that's a really pretty wicked thing to do to young families who are struggling, trying to just move along their life, right? So it's a proxy issue, right? Their real problem is not actually with young families. Their real problem is the taxes being driven by local schools. But they're having a hard time winning that fight because the teachers' unions and other interests are so powerful that they're just basically moving on from that fight and fighting it in other areas. Such as zoning to keep young families out. Okay. Instead of going after the budgets and trying to control those better.
At the same time, the enrollment's been going down on New Hampshire schools.
Which is a very important point to bring up because not only is what they're doing by zoning to keep young families out immoral, it actually doesn't solve the issue because we've seen enrollment goes down and schools still get more money.
Yeah.
Right? So it doesn't actually work. So what needs to be done, we tried this. We tried to put in the budget, and a small group of Republicans joined with Democrats to prevent us from putting a check on local school budgets. We tried to do it.
What kind of check was that? Because there were several things. That...
It was, I don't remember the exact outlines of it, but it was essentially going to create a maximum budget increase that could only be overridden by something like a 3/5 vote or something like that. Okay. It was just one more layer because people are struggling with the amount of money that they have to pay toward these failing institutions. And I'm not even one who wants to abolish schools. I'd much rather reform them. But in their current condition, it would be better if they didn't exist. But they're fighting this issue by proxy. And I wish we could move the conversation to where it needs to be. And I wish people would stop with there's some really weird ideas out there. Like some of this legislation is aimed at creating, World Economic Forum 15-minute cities.
That was a
regulation.
That was a concern that I've had when I've seen some, but
sure.
I do think that when it comes to, like, I don't want to live in a pod. I don't think anybody wants to live in a pod. If you don't
absolutely not.
What we're talking about, if you're listening, then when COVID hit was the first time I'd heard about it.
Yeah.
It's 2030. You'll own nothing. You'll be happy. And now that's one argument that people that are against all these zoning zoning bills are making.
Exactly. They're suggesting 15-minute cities. And just to give you a quick explanation, 15-minute cities are this design idea, central planning. You're going to create these cities where basically people live within a 15-minute radius their entire lives. They never have to leave it. Everything's right there. Your travel is restricted. It becomes like communist China.
The dystopian side of it is that you can't leave it.
Yes, exactly.
Which is what they were doing in places like New Zealand and Australia during COVID.
Exactly.
And you couldn't leave your house more than 5 kilometers.
It's miserable and horrible stuff.
Right.
Okay. And the people who are putting out this information that these bills are oriented toward that, they only have one tiny leg to stand on, and that's some of the people involved in this on the ideological side have put out libertarian think tank paperwork that puts them in common cause with the communists in certain narrow areas, right? But that's the extent of it. The reality is most of this stuff, and if there's problems with it, I won't vote for it. But most of this stuff is designed to deregulate. It's designed to allow more freedom of movement, more freedom of building, more freedom in life, so people can make their decisions they want to with their own property within reason.
New Hampshire's a fairly rural state.
Some of it, yeah.
And we've had a 20% increase in my town alone on the population. I think statewide it's around 20%.
It depends on what period of time
Since
we're looking at.
2020. From 2020 till now. I believe that's what.
I think it's a little lower than that, but I think
17,
it has grown a little
17, 20, around 20.
Yeah. Our area here, though, is more rural. It's more easily accessible. It's outside of the areas that are outrageously overpriced. So it makes sense that we're seeing more.
But we also have, what I've found online is that we have a deficit of about 20,000 homes in the market right now.
I've heard similar numbers.
And with that, on top of an extra $15 trillion that's been injected into the economy, housing prices are twice as much as they were 5 years ago.
Yep.
But wages haven't gone up. They've gone up
a
little bit.
Not commensurate with inflation, and certainly not commensurate with housing inflation.
They have gone up. So I would say if you were getting a laborer job in a construction site in 2019, 2018, your starting pay $15 to $18 an hour was decent for a starting pay. Now you got to make probably 22 to 25.
If that.
Yeah. And then if you want to raise a family, you have to make a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So these are all issues that people in New Hampshire, not just Americans, but people of New Hampshire are facing right now, and that's driving. Nobody that is in their early 20s is thinking about starting a family.
No, it's miserable, and it's a multifactorial problem too. I mean, some places might not be experiencing this problem. Places where people are fleeing, like New York, probably doesn't have this kind of problem. But places that people want to come to because we have freedom, because we have economic prosperity is on the menu at least. People want to come here for those kinds of things. And we have to find some solutions to these problems. And where local governments have overstepped, and I'm open to a lot of debate as to where exactly those lines ought to be. But things like increasing the minimum building lot size to 5 acres. What developer is going to plop a 2-bedroom ranch like mine on a 5, 7, 9 acre property?
The land alone is $200,000.
Right.
In today's
so
market.
It doesn't make financial sense. And those are the kind of houses that we need to produce at least some of for younger families to get their start in. All right. So some of this exclusionary zoning stuff really does violate, in my opinion, Christian ethical principles. Because look at the Bible. God cares an awful lot about private property rights. All right. It's all in there. And God cares an awful lot about impartiality. And that means you don't get to zone to exclude the next young family from moving into your town just because you're afraid it might raise taxes. I'm sympathetic on the tax front, and I really want to move forward with solutions to control out of control school spending. I mean, we've got so many problems with school spending. And when I was on the education committee for 2 years, and I got a real hard look at that. And so much of it is because of mandatory positions that exist because of government money, federal government money. And federal government money that oftentimes we don't even get because they don't adequately reimburse us for what they're supposed to.
Mandatory positions?
Right. So federal government creates all these different programs, right? They pass these bills and they have the carrot and stick, right? So the carrot is, you get money for doing this stuff. But as a part of that, they tend to create, diversity, equity, inclusion positions and other administrator positions and this position and that position. That's how we've wound up in this situation where the relative growth of teachers versus the relative growth of administrative positions over teachers, it's like 5 times or something like that in the administrative side. So and which, by the way, has been a common complaint recently. New Hampshire teachers aren't getting paid enough. Yeah, I don't doubt that that's true. But it's not because there isn't enough education funding. It's because all this money is going to administrators and other things.
Yep. So, as far as the zoning goes, are you worried at all about any of these bills potentially making it so? Because one of the arguments I've heard is that that all these developers are going to come in, they're going to put in these giant low-income housing projects, and then that'll be housed by illegal aliens.
Yeah,
so
definitely. I mean, so you have to take every bill individually and according to the language that's in the bill. And if there is a bill that I come across that I have to vote on that would theoretically enable something like that, I would vote against it all day, every day. In fact, I did. I'm the one who caught it when it happened about a month and a half ago.
Which one was it?
There was a bill. So there was a bill that began life as a relatively uncontroversial bill dealing with allowing churches to, if they have a pastor that lives, instead of in the rectory, they live off campus somewhere, they could rent their living space in that rectory and not have to pay taxes on it. It would be under that umbrella, that tax-free umbrella. Not super controversial, right? We're probably talking like one apartment they could rent to somebody, whatever. Not a big deal. But a floor amendment came that was going to probably pass with flying colors because nobody looked at it real hard, and because it came at the last minute, and because we were busy. But I read that thing and I realized what it might do. It took all of the guardrails off of the original bill, and at least in theory, it would have enabled, these Episcopalian churches or whoever else to basically build an apartment block, rent it out, whoever, illegals, whatever, bypassing basically all regulations, tax-free, as long as that money was going to pay the pastors and the elders of the church.
Oh.
And it was put in at the last minute, and I don't know why it was crafted the way it was crafted. I'm deeply suspicious about where that was aimed.
Do you think it has anything to do with the Catholic organizations that have been supposedly trafficking?
So it's not just the Catholic organizations who've been doing this.
NGOs.
There's multiple. The Lutheran organizations, the Episcopalian organizations, they've all been involved in this.
Why so many religious organizations do you think are involved in this?
That would be a difficult nut to crack exactly why, but these are religious organizations that fell victim to the social gospel movement, basically the inclusion of socialism into the gospel.
Okay.
And certain incentives were established that promoted this sort of perverse relationship with the government to resettle refugees. They get paid a ton of money for it. Well, getting paid a ton of money makes them want more of it. So they lobby for less restrictions and back and forth. So I have my suspicions about why it was done. It's possible it was just a badly written bill. It could be. But I was the one who caught that, and I was the one who whipped the votes and got that killed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very sensitive to these ideas that we're going to have apartment blocks full of illegals paid for by the World Health Organization or whatever.
Or a brothel.
I don't want that to happen. Brothels are even worse.
Brothels and casinos
brothels
in every town.
and casinos are even worse because, well, first of all, brothels aren't legal at all, but casinos have been somewhat legalized. I'm kind of iffy about that. Whatever. I'll err on the side of freedom. But that's the sort of thing that you should definitely give the locals a veto over if they don't want that in their community. Right?
Yeah.
That's a whole different story.
I can agree with that.
Okay. So, but none of the bills I've seen would allow that in any way.
There's one accessory dwelling unit bill that I've seen that would actually help me out personally.
I'm not surprised.
I'm pretty sure, but I don't know if it's capped at 500 square feet. I've looked into one of the organizations that was called out for helping draft legislation, but I didn't see a square footage cap on the legislation.
Yeah.
I'd have to look a little deeper into it. But there's so much arguing going on about it. It's hard to tell.
It is. And like I said, it's become so hyperbolic, and we've gotten so far away from the foundational issue, which is an ethical issue of property rights and what should people be able to do with their property versus how you should be able to regulate what somebody else does with their property, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the fundamental issue.
Yeah.
And I'm sensitive to arguments on both sides. I don't want to be causing nuisance for people. I certainly don't. But we do have to solve the housing issue.
Absolutely.
And we have a lot of people who have openly admitted that they want a zone to exclude young families because of the property tax impact it might have on them.
That's sad.
And that's something I don't like, and I won't vote in favor of anything like that. I think that's a improper, unethical use of government force. And I think there's ways we can do this. And I think some of the bills are decent. Other ones I have a little more question over. There's some nuance. But I think there's some things we can do to help.
Which ones do you have the questions over?
There's some of the bigger bills. Some of the bills that have a little bit more meat to them. I want to hear more argumentation as to where that line should fall between nuisance and legitimate interests of needing to build more housing. Mm-hmm. There's one that I'm a little on the fence about. I'm leaning no on right now, which is one of the ones that leadership really likes, but it's about having third parties who can basically do some of what is normally done by government in process approval. Basically what it does is allows developers or whatever to pay a third party to do their own whatever inspection or whatever else has to happen, because the government's so darn slow in doing these things, and the government often says no when they should be saying yes. So it's a problem, but I'm afraid that handing that off to third parties creates a partiality that favors big wealthy developers.
Mm-hmm. Whoever's paying them.
Right. Who can pay these companies.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of, smaller mom and pop developers who want to have an apartment or two. I don't think that's right. Just on an ethical front, I don't like that idea. Now, the counter argument is, we really need this housing, and the government is doing bad things. This is one of those situations where I think it's probably better if we just find a way to make the government stop doing bad things.
Well, I would think that one of the things that maybe the government's not doing bad things. Maybe they don't have the personnel to keep up with all the inspections that they need to make. But if they're having,
it's possible
if they have more people that are going for inspections, that means there's more people taking out building permits. The government makes money off those building permits. You would think that they can hire more people, if not part-time people, to handle those inspections.
So it's going to be a little bit of both. But the fact is, even if it's because they lack the inspectors to get that done, there's a good chance that there's some ill intent behind that, because people on my end are the ones who decide how many inspectors there are going to be in our legislation and in the money we assign. And there's a bunch of people, wearing suits like me, who are representing other people who don't want development in their nice communities.
Yep.
And they want to keep them out. So maybe having fewer inspectors and slowing the process down to a grinding halt is what they want.
What about more industry in New Hampshire? Do you think we need more?
I mean, it depends on exactly what we're talking about. But generally speaking, if people want to develop for industrial use and there's a reasonable place to put them, that's probably a decent thing. It's a good thing.
But do you think that New Hampshire's friendly enough towards that?
I think the most unfriendly thing we have toward industry is our electricity prices.
Okay. Now, there was a bill, I think you co-sponsored it. It had to do with, what is it here?
It might take a minute. I think I was sponsored. I was prime on 14 and maybe co-sponsor on another 14 this year. I had a full plate.
No, I didn't write it down here. It was so there's a as far as the electrical grid goes, we're part of the same one as
the rest of the New England,
right? Which is
ISO, run by ISO
New England. Now there was a bill that went through. I don't know if you had co-sponsored it.
I'm not sure if I was on that one or not. I like the idea though. The idea that take a hard look at that grid and see if
it investigates ISO New England.
Yeah, it investigates what's going on.
So what is ISO New England exactly?
So some of this gets into technical details that are a little bit beyond me. Okay. But basically, ISO New England is the grid operator for New England. We have a grid that is integrated with the other Northeast states. What that means is that we can be significantly overridden in the things that we want to do by neighboring states if we're not on the same page policy-wise. That's the reason that electricity is ultimately so expensive, is because our socialist neighbors won't allow any new pipeline capacity. So they won't allow a natural gas pipeline to be built to bring natural gas here that we could use for relatively inexpensive and relatively low pollution energy. They just won't allow it to happen. So we're stuck, in this situation. We're trying to figure out what the best route forward is. We're looking really hard at small nuclear reactors, stuff like that. Maybe even a second one down in Seabrook. I'm not sure. There was supposed to be a second one down in Seabrook. It just never happened because of all that Soviet and weird environmentalist interference. Environmentalism is terrible. I'm a conservationist. I love nature. I love animals.
But there's a difference.
I like conservationism. Environmentalism is just a commie scheme. That's it.
Money making.
It's about breaking the economy and making certain people wealthy and powerful.
Yeah, there was one Dem state rep that was talking about people having nuclear reactors in their backyards.
That would be an interesting future. Little weird, but the idea of microgrids, like small nuclear reactors powering neighborhoods or towns, is an interesting idea.
They're a lot safer than they used to be.
Much. Not only are they a lot safer, they actually, a lot of them, the modern ones, use the waste from the old ones as their energy source.
No, we should have plenty of that.
So, hey, there's an easy use of nuclear waste product right there. Use it for more energy.
Right.
They are much safer than they used to be. They're basically meltdown proof.
And they're the cleanest
they're designed.
Source of energy.
Well, there's no pollution whatsoever. There's nothing. It's just the only reason that nuclear energy isn't by far the cheapest form of energy is because of all the regulations that have been placed on it. And those regulations, by and large, exist for the purpose of making it more expensive than everything else. Because they don't want nuclear. It's the same reason that we've been pursuing these stupid solar panels and wind turbines all over the place. Mm-hmm. Now, don't be wrong. If you want a solar panel or wind turbine, more power to you. Go get one. Put it in your yard. I don't care. But these commercial and large-scale projects are horribly inefficient. They produce expensive power and low reliability power. All right, they're not a solution. They're actually making our situation worse, which is why we need to be getting up on other things. But the only thing that looks realistic is maybe nuclear, maybe if the Trump administration can minimize regulation a little bit, because it's so hard to pursue. But we need to figure out the situation. We need to see what it looks like to have our own grid. Now, I don't know what that looks like from a technical standpoint. I don't know what it costs. It might be prohibitive, but it would be wise for us to pursue, because guess what? None of us have lived in an era of grid failures, brownouts, where we don't have power, but, an hour or two a day, like they might in South Africa. None of us have lived like that. But if we continue down this road, we're going to find out what it's like to live like that. And if we continue to subject ourselves to the veto authority of Massachusetts and Vermont and Maine and New York, we're going to find out what that's like.
California's starting to get into the beginning stages of that, it sounds like.
Yeah, they've been having their little brownouts for years. Luckily, they've been able to keep things online, which I think is significantly driven by their nuclear power. But it's crazy what they're doing. The fact that they think that this society can just coast by without, smart energy policy. The fact that they think they can power us with giant batteries that have never before existed and require more lithium and cobalt than can be mined in a decade. Mm-hmm. They think that's the future? Are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen pictures of the lithium mines, and they're pretty gnarly.
They were talking about turning Schiller Station down in Newington into some kind of giant lithium battery to hold energy from offshore wind. Are you kidding me?
Lithium,
you know how dangerous that is?
They don't do well in the cold. So
they don't do well in the cold, and they don't do well with water either. And it's on the water.
Yeah.
So Schiller Station is literally on the Piscataqua River.
Yeah, there's nothing like driving through the mountains in New Hampshire and seeing those windmills too.
Oh, I hate those.
Not spinning.
Not spinning. And when they do, they kill bald eagles.
Yeah. And the negatives of the windmills and the turbines in the ocean, the windmills that are out in the ocean, the negatives of them, they're not even raised.
Huge externalities. We don't even know exactly what they're doing to the marine life, but it looks like they're killing an awful lot of whales and dolphins.
I know some
other things.
I know some fishermen that are really upset about that.
I mean, and if you know anything about just the fundamentals of ecology, you understand that by taking out certain top tier animals, you can create a catastrophic domino effect.
Mm-hmm.
Like just a communist story out of North Korea. When the first Kim rose to power in the communist takeover, they went on this plan to try to increase their grain production, right? They wanted biggest grain production ever, like big, huge. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, they figure the birds are eating some of our grain. They come around and they eat our grain and they fly. So we're going to kill all the birds. So he put the word out to the people, you got to kill the birds. And they, basically put guns on the people. So the people, what do they have? They have pots and pans. So 24 hours a day for, weeks, they chased birds around in the woods, banging pots and pans so the birds couldn't get any sleep. They were stressed. And they fell out of the tree dead from stress and not being able to eat anything because they're banging pots and pans at them all day for weeks, right? So they killed all the birds. What happens when you kill all the birds? Well, now they've got an insect infestation. And what do the insects do? They ate all the grain. Mm-hmm. And then the people starved. Mm-hmm. Okay? What do we think is going to happen if we just kill all our dolphins and whales with wind turbines? You think that might have some down, second, third order effects that might not be good for us? It's silly. It's really silly.
So what do you see? How does the future in New Hampshire look to you?
It's a mixed bag. I have some hope, right? We have to solve an awful lot of problems. And some of those problems seem insurmountable given where we're presently at. And when I say where we're presently at, I mean the kind of solutions that people consider culturally acceptable. We need to move a lot of people culturally. And I do fear that things are going to have to get a little bit worse before people begin to wake up to all these problems. And we start fixing them, and I hope they do fast enough. But we need to pursue a lot of policy solutions in Concord. We need solutions for dealing with federalism and a proper relationship with the federal government. I'm looking at possibly bringing a bill to bring back the state guard in a proper capacity, because one of the things we don't have is good information.
The state guard.
State guard. One of the things we don't have is good information. Like we, as lawmakers, we get our information mostly from the news. Well, I don't, but most do. We don't have special intelligence briefings telling us what's going on. We don't hear much from the police or the military. And what we do hear from the police and military is filtered down through fusion centers coming from federal intelligence agencies. How much do we trust them right now? We need some basic intelligence capacity in the state of New Hampshire to help guide us a little bit, I think. I'd like to look at doing this in some point in the not too distant future. It's going to cost a little bit of money, but sometimes you have to spend a little bit of money to do stuff.
Have you talked about that with anybody else in Concord and had any?
I have. It's going to be a tough sell because you got a whole bunch of Republicans who don't want to spend any money whatsoever on anything, which I kind of understand. We're in debt and whatnot. You have a bunch of libertarians who don't want to do anything military related no matter what, right? And then you've got Democrats who basically don't want to do anything good no matter what. So it's going to be a tough sell.
How do you think Democrats would handle control of a state guard?
Oh, they would freak out. Look at what happened when DeSantis signed a bill bringing only a couple hundred members into the Florida State Guard. They framed it like an insurrection, like Florida was going to take on the federal military and secede or something like that, something crazy. No, they're just doing mostly disaster relief. But that's how they will frame it, and it creates complications.
Yeah. Everything's authoritarian.
Yeah.
That they don't like.
Oh, yeah.
So, what is the biggest thing that you're working on this legislative session?
One of the biggest things that I've managed to pull off, which was a small miracle, and I didn't really think it was going to work going in. I mean, I put 14 bills in. And one of them that I thought was going to be one of the most difficult ones actually passed. And that was a bill taking on the federal government and their authority over the states. Now, it was done through the mechanism of guns. Basically, I put a bill in that it establishes a new category of firearms that can be produced and accessories. Basically just says if you make a gun in New Hampshire or a gun part, if you label it, through engraving, for New Hampshire use only, not for export, it creates this certain category of gun that cannot leave the state. In fact, there's a criminal penalty if it leaves the state for whoever exports it. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take aim at an old decision, Willard versus Fickburn, that gave the federal government control over all commerce in the states. The federal constitution says that they have control over commerce between the states, all right? So that's in the Constitution. That was put there because they were afraid of there was protectionism going on between the states, like states tariffing each other, basically. You can't have that in a union, federalist country. So the federal government got the power to stop that. But Willard Fickburn was a mid-20th century decision that said, well, this farmer is growing grain on his land that he's using to feed his own animals, and the federal government wanted to stop him from doing that. So what they said was, well, if he didn't sell or if he didn't grow that grain, he'd have to buy it. And if he would buy it, that is impacting the market, which is a national market. So him not buying grain because he's growing it actually affects the national market, which is interstate commerce. So we're gonna claim the authority to shut down him growing grain on his own land to feed his animals. And the Supreme Court upheld that based on that explanation. It was one of the most ridiculous decisions we've ever had. And that was the decision that empowered the federal government to end the federalist nature of American government and take all the power from the states. It enabled them to do this system that they have, where they take our money in taxes and they say, okay, state, we're going to give you a bunch of that money back, but only if you do what we want. It's extortion. Mm-hmm. So this bill basically takes aim at that decision. If we can get it, we tucked it into the budget too, so it might pass. It might just get through. If we do, it creates an opportunity to have a court challenge, going all the way up to the courts, to challenge that decision that if it were overturned, it would be the biggest thing in 100 years to fix American government.
I like it.
I like it too.
That sounds good. Yeah, because when I was talking to Glenn on the last episode I didn't realize how many hoops you got to jump through to turn something into law.
Yeah.
And then the courts can just strike it right down.
Well, that's one of the biggest problems, isn't it? Like, we go through all this work to put a bill in the House, a spending bill, and it has to go through the House, and it has to go to the Senate. Then the governor has to sign it, right? And then the court just goes, I don't like this based on some stupid principle. And I say stupid principle, not good principle, because if the court was acting with prudence and in a good way, I would have no problem with them striking down unconstitutional laws, like the NFA, for instance. But they don't do that. They only strike down laws from the right. They never strike down laws from the left, right? It's part of the institutionalized repressive tolerance that this country has had for a long time now, but especially accelerated under the principle of critical legal theory from Harvard. So we've got this problem where the courts are way out of control. We're basically, in a judicial oligarchy of sorts. They're not supposed to be supreme. They're supposed to be co-equal with the legislature and with the executive.
That's why we have 3 branches.
Right. But they've seized way, way more authority than they're due. And it's about time that we held them responsible. I've been trying to do that. I tried to impeach 2 members of the judiciary this year. Both didn't work. Yeah. One of them got close. I actually tried to impeach that magistrate who let that stabber back on the street in Manchester, just like hours after stabbing 79 times. I actually got a majority vote in the House, but because of the rules, we needed a 2/3 vote to suspend the rules to bring the articles. So we've got some work to do, but we're getting better.
What do you think about monetary policy in New Hampshire? What can be done there? Because I think one of the biggest drivers for housing being unaffordable is inflation.
You're not wrong, but the thing is, once you've established this system of patronage where so many people are dependent on these special, whether or not you consider them welfare or handouts, or whether you consider them what they're owed, like Social Security, for instance, the fact is that they're unsustainable. They were never sustainable, but they're also untouchable. So once you've established this sort of client class,
it's one of those taboo subjects,
right? Once you establish a client class who's dependent on these things, and you have a voting bloc who's going to, vote for this stuff no matter what, it's actually kind of the same thing that happens with zoning. People protecting their property values in a bubble from any sort of correction. Same idea. It becomes so difficult to fix those problems because anybody who even tries would be voted out in a second.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what happens there, but if we don't do anything, eventually they're going to collapse. They will eventually collapse, and we will eventually, the dollar itself will collapse too.
Yeah.
And I don't know what happens then. It's not pretty, but I don't know. I don't know how to fix that right now. It's so far outside the Overton window. It's like you touch these things, it's like, wow, you're done.
Yeah. Yeah, because somebody had said to me on Facebook on a comment, because I said we have a housing shortage and we have inflation, and that's why we're at for the cost of housing. And everybody just says, well, how do we fix it? I don't know. And the Fed?
Well, yeah, I mean, I like the idea of that. I don't like the idea of central banks. I think a central bank is immoral.
Yeah.
I think the market functions if it is allowed to. The trouble is it functions for everybody, not just for a select few. And those select few don't want it to function for everybody. They want special favor.
Right. And when you can get everybody fighting and then print a bunch of money,
right,
those select few can make even more money.
We're back to the demos again. Divide the demos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, this has been really awesome.
It's been fun.
You have a wealth of knowledge when it comes to a lot of different issues, and
thank you.
Your depth on communism and pretty much collectivism is really impressive. And I want to thank you for coming by. And
thank you. Appreciate the invite.
On the
I hope people, are edified somehow from this chat. It's been fun.
Yeah. So I hope you come back.
Appreciate it.
All right.
We can do that.